All right, let's dive right into this explainer. We hear endless headlines about inflation, interest rates, dodging recessions, you know the drill. But what does all of that actually mean for countries that are desperately trying to catch up? Today, we're taking a really fascinating journey. We're starting with a 30,000-foot view of the global economy, and then zooming all the way down to look at one highly ambitious case study.
See, while advanced economies are, thankfully, finally stabilizing after years of pandemic chaos, we've got to ask a pretty tough question. Are developing nations keeping pace, or are they literally being left behind? Because, let's be real, merely dodging a global crash, that doesn't mean everyone is moving forward at the exact same speed.
So, here is our roadmap for today. We'll start with the state of the global economy, move into the developing economy divide, then unpack Indonesia's Golden 2045 vision, look at their 4 pillars of progress, and finally, wrap up with overcoming debt and risks.
Okay, Section 1. State of the global economy. A subdued stabilization.
Right off the bat, avoiding a global recession absolutely does not mean we're accelerating. The World Bank's chief economist recently noted that we appear to be on a final approach for a soft landing. But think about it. A soft landing just means we didn't crash the plane into a mountain, right? It doesn't mean the plane is actually flying fast. Honestly, we are kind of stuck in the slow lane.
And here is the number proving that. Global growth is projected to hold steady at a very subdued 2.6% this year. Now, on the surface, you might think, hey, growth is growth. But context is literally everything here. That 2.6% is noticeably below the pre-pandemic average of 3.1%. Now, missing 0.5% might sound absolutely tiny, but when you compound that globally, wow, we are talking about trillions of dollars of lost potential.
So why is growth so sluggish? Well, global consumer price inflation is dropping to around 3.5% this year, which is good, but the descent is painfully slow. Core inflation remains stubbornly high. And what that means is central banks have to keep interest rates elevated. High interest rates are basically slamming the emergency brakes on the entire global economic engine.
Moving on to Section 2, the developing economy divide, widening gaps in prosperity.
You know, when that global economic engine puts on the brakes, it's the passengers in the backseat who feel it the hardest. While advanced economies are finally recovering, nearly half of developing economies are seeing their per capita income gap actively widen. Let that sink in for a second. By the end of this year, 1 in 4 developing nations will actually be poorer than they were on the exact eve of the pandemic. They're not just stalling, they're actively losing ground. The sheer scale of this is just staggering. More than 80% of the global population currently lives in economies that are growing slower today than in the decade before the pandemic. To put that into perspective, that is 8 out of every 10 people on Earth trapped in underperforming economies. And adding to that tremendous burden, those sky-high interest rates we talked about. Because borrowing costs are so incredibly high right now, 40% of emerging markets are acutely vulnerable to crippling debt stress. When governments have to spend massive chunks of their budget just paying off the interest on loans, well, they simply can't invest in schools or hospitals or roads. It becomes this really vicious, incredibly hard-to-break cycle.
Which brings us to Section 3, Indonesia's Golden 2045 vision, the micro view.
So faced with high debt, subdued growth, and this constantly widening prosperity gap, how exactly does any emerging economy leap into developed status today? Well, it requires a blueprint, a strategy that actively restructures a country from the inside out.
For Indonesia, their answer is what they call the Golden 2045 vision. And let me tell you, this is a highly ambitious, multi-generational strategy. The ultimate goal? To hit a massive $7.3 trillion GDP and become a top 5 global economy by the year 2045, which, not coincidentally, is exactly 100 years after their independence.
To really understand this level of determination, you have to look at their recent history. Back in 1997, the Asian financial crisis absolutely crippled their development. I mean, it was devastating. But they staged a remarkable recovery, even joining the G20 by 2009. And that immense resilience set the stage for a literally once-in-a-lifetime window of opportunity that's set to begin around 2030.
That window of opportunity is driven by something called a demographic bonus. Basically, this happens when your working-age population vastly outnumbers your dependents. Between 2030 and 2040, an astonishing 64% of Indonesia's projected 297 million citizens will be of productive working age. But, as we know, simply having the people isn't enough, right?
You actually have to give them the tools to succeed.
Let's look at how they do that in Section 4, 4 Pillars of Progress, Executing the Blueprint.
So how are they actually executing this massive plan? It all relies on 4 core pillars, purposely moving away from the old trap of just extracting raw resources. Pillar 1 prioritizes human capital and technology. Pillar 2 focuses heavily on sustainable green economic development. Pillar 3 is all about ensuring wealth is spread equitably through massive infrastructure projects. And Pillar 4 tackles the tough stuff, strengthening national resilience and governance.
And you know, what's really fascinating is that this isn't just some trendy, fleeting political talking point. Former President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono explicitly outlined this exact vision back in 2013. It is a deeply rooted, multi-generational national dream. Subsequent administrations have adopted the exact same framework. It's a unified national target that genuinely transcends typical everyday political cycles.
Finally, Section 5, Overcoming Debt and Risks, Aligning Local Action with Global Warnings.
Okay, so how does this incredibly optimistic local dream actually hold up against those harsh global realities we talked about earlier? Remember that terrifying stat? The one about 40% of developing nations facing severe debt stress? Well, Indonesia is actively fighting that trend. Domestic headlines right now are actually highlighting a declining government debt ratio. So while other nations are frankly drowning in higher interest rates, Indonesia is actively purposefully reducing its debt relative to its GDP. And why is reducing that debt so absolutely critical right now? Because it creates what economists call fiscal space, basically extra breathing room in the budget. And this allows them to enact the exact structural policies the World Bank says are literally mandatory for survival: improving public investment, building human capital, closing gender gaps, and expanding that fiscal space. Honestly, Indonesia's blueprint is practically a direct answer to the World Bank's warning checklist.
So, what should you take away from this explainer today? Well, it's that a sluggish global economy doesn't actually have to dictate a nation's destiny. Structured public investment, disciplined debt management, and visionary planning can absolutely forge a clear path forward. As Indonesia races toward its 2045 centennial, we really have to wonder, will their blueprint become the ultimate survival guide for the rest of the developing world? If they can harness that massive demographic bonus amidst all these global headwinds, they might just prove that breaking out of the slow lane is entirely possible. So what do you think? Keep asking the big questions, and I'll see you in the next explainer.